I'd been a ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 6 months when I started noticing the discrepancies in the missing persons database. Small inconsistencies that wouldn't have registered if I hadn't been obsessively incident reports during my overnight shifts at the Sugarlands Visitor Center. Looking for patterns in the data because the job was boring and I was young and still believed that being thorough and dedicated would lead to promotion and respect rather than the subtle ostracism I was beginning to experience from the senior rangers who'd learned to stop asking questions about things that happened in the backcountry. The discrepancies were minor at first. A missing person case from 2015 that appeared in the Tennessee State database, but not in the park records. Another from 2018 that showed conflicting dates between federal and local reports, but as I dug deeper I found dozens of them, maybe 100. Cases that seemed to flicker in and out of existence depending on which system I checked. Like someone was actively scrubbing records or maintaining parallel databases that tracked different versions of the same events. I made the mistake of mentioning my findings to Dale Pruitt, a 20-year veteran who'd been stationed in the Smokies since before I was born, and I watched his weathered face close down like shutters slamming over windows. Watched him go from friendly mentor to cold stranger in the space between one sentence and the next. "You need to stop looking at those records," he told me in a voice that had none of his usual warmth. "There are things in this park that predate the National Park Service by thousands of years. Things that have an understanding with the people who've been here long enough to learn the rules. And those rules include not drawing attention to the spaces where the normal world and the other world overlap, not creating documentation that might make people curious about why certain hikers never come back from certain trails during certain times of year." He wouldn't elaborate despite my questions, just told me to stick to my assigned duties and stop trying to find patterns in data that was deliberately maintained to obscure patterns. And I probably should have listened. Should have recognized the genuine fear beneath his gruff warning, but I was 24 and arrogant and convinced that transparency and accountability mattered more than superstition and institutional cover-ups. I started hiking the trails mentioned most frequently in the discrepant reports, taking my days off to explore remote sections of the park that saw minimal traffic. And I began to notice things that my training hadn't prepared me for, small wrongnesses that accumulated until they formed a picture of something fundamentally broken in the fabric of the park itself. There were trees that appeared on no survey map, massive hemlocks and oaks that should have been notable landmarks but existed in a kind of perceptual blind spot, visible only when approached from certain angles at certain times of day. There were sounds in the forest that followed acoustic rules that didn't match any known wildlife. Patterns of calls and responses that seemed designed to triangulate my position, to track my movement through the wilderness with an intelligence that suggested coordination and purpose. And there were the clearings, dozens of them scattered throughout the backcountry, perfect circles of bare earth where nothing would grow, surrounded by trees that all bent inward at exactly the same angle, as if the forest itself was leaning down to observe whatever happened in those spaces where the soil was stained dark with something that wasn't quite the right color for old blood. I found my first body in February, 3 miles up the Gregory Bald Trail in a section marked on my map as administrative closure, ecological restoration, though I'd never seen any signs of restoration work or any barriers preventing access. She was maybe 19, wearing hiking gear that looked expensive and well-maintained, and she'd been dead for perhaps a day based on the rigor mortis. But the condition of her body made no medical sense, her skin covered in a pattern of perfect circular bruises arranged in mathematical precision, her eyes open and staring upward with an expression that somehow conveyed both terror and ecstasy, and her hands clutched around something I couldn't see, fingers locked in a death grip around empty air, as if she'd been holding some object at the moment of death, and that object had simply ceased to exist in our visible spectrum. I radioed it in immediately, following protocol. But the response I got from dispatch wasn't the coordinated emergency response I expected. It was Dale's voice, tight with something between anger and resignation, telling me to mark my GPS coordinates and wait for him to arrive before doing anything else. Not to photograph the body, not to disturb the scene, not to mention this to anyone else on the radio. He showed up 2 hours later with 3 other senior rangers I recognized but didn't know well, and they approached the body with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time dealing with this specific situation. Photographing it from specific angles with a camera that looked decades old, collecting samples of the surrounding soil and vegetation, wrapping the corpse in a thermal blanket that seemed designed to contain something other than heat. She came up here during the wrong moon phase, Dale told me without preamble. Probably didn't even know there was a right and wrong time to visit certain parts of the park, so now she's gone, and we'll file the paperwork saying she fell and hit her head, and her family will get closure, and you'll learn that some things are more important than truth. Like keeping people from knowing there are places in these mountains where reality works differently, where the rules that govern normal life don't fully apply, and where going hiking during the 3 nights surrounding the new moon makes you visible to things that are usually content to ignore human presence. I quit the Park Service a week later, couldn't stomach the complicity, the institutional acceptance of regular sacrifice to whatever inhabited the spaces between the mapped trails. But quitting didn't free me from what I'd learned, didn't erase the knowledge that there are places in the Smokies where people go missing according to schedules that correlate with lunar phases and solar events, where the forest itself seems to hunger for human presence during specific windows of time, and where the rangers who've been there long enough understand their job isn't really about conservation and public safety. It's about maintaining equilibrium with something ancient and patient that allows us to exist in its territory as long as we feed it occasionally, as long as we don't draw too much attention to the mechanism of feeding, as long as we keep the clearings secret and the databases inconsistent and the families convinced that their lost loved ones died in ordinary ways from ordinary causes. I still have the photos I took before Dale arrived. Images I captured on my personal phone before I understood I wasn't supposed to document the scene. And sometimes late at night I look at them and notice details I didn't see at the time, like the way the tree shadows around the body don't quite match the angle of the sun, or the shape visible in the background between 2 hemlocks that might be a rock formation or might be something else. Something tall and still, and watching the scene with an attention that predates human observation. I've tried to show the photos to other people, to journalists and investigators and former rangers who left the service for similar reasons. But the images don't transfer correctly. They pixelate and corrupt in the sending, arriving as blank files or noise patterns that resolve into nothing coherent. And I've come to understand that whatever exists in those clearings has its own ways of maintaining secrecy, its own methods of ensuring that evidence doesn't propagate beyond the boundaries it's willing to accept. Last month I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, just a single attachment. And when I opened it I found a photograph of myself taken from behind, standing in one of those clearings at night, illuminated by moonlight. That shouldn't exist during the new moon phase, and I don't remember ever visiting that location at night. have no conscious recollection of standing in that exact spot in that exact position. But the image is recent, the jacket I'm wearing in. The photo is one I bought just 6 weeks ago, and I can see in the picture that my hands are clutched around something invisible, gripping empty air with the same death grip intensity I'd seen on the dead hiker. And I understand now that leaving the Park Service didn't end my relationship with whatever claims those clearings. It just changed the nature of the relationship, made me something between a witness and a participant. And I wake up sometimes with dirt under my fingernails and my hiking boots by the door, covered in mud from trails I don't remember walking. And I know it's only a matter of time before I appear in someone else's missing persons report, before some young ranger finds my body in a clearing surrounded by trees bent inward at impossible angles, before Dale and his crew arrive to document the scene and file the paperwork and add another discrepancy to the databases that someone smarter or more stubborn than me will eventually notice and begin investigating, starting the cycle again. Because the park needs rangers, and the rangers need believers, and the believers need to learn eventually what belief in truth costs when you're dealing with truths that were never meant to be documented or spoken or carried back from the spaces where the mountains remember what they were before we gave them names and trails and visitor centers, staffed by people who understand that some questions are better left unasked. The blizzard hit the Blue Ridge Parkway around 6 p.m. on February 14th, 3 hours earlier than the Weather Service predicted and with twice the intensity they'd forecasted. And by the time I realized I wasn't going to make it to the nearest exit before visibility dropped to 0, I'd already passed the last ranger station and entered a 50-mile stretch of mountain highway that wound through wilderness so remote that cell coverage was theoretical even in good weather. I'd been driving from Asheville to visit my sister in Roanoke, a trip I'd made dozens of times, and I knew I should have postponed when I saw the storm warnings that morning. But Sarah was going through a rough divorce and she'd asked me specifically to come that weekend. And I'd convinced myself that I could beat the worst of it if I just drove a little faster, pushed a little harder, made decisions based on what I wanted to be true rather than what the data was telling me was true. Which is exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed in the mountains during winter. My car slid sideways on an ice patch, and I overcorrected instinctively, sending the vehicle into a slow-motion spin that ended with my front bumper buried in a snowbank and my engine making sounds like a dying animal before it quit entirely, leaving me in sudden silence broken only by the wind screaming around the car's frame and the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal. I tried the ignition repeatedly, each attempt more desperate than the last, but the starter just clicked uselessly, and when I checked my phone I found exactly what I'd expected. No signal, 12% battery, and the temperature display reading 8 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. I had a winter emergency kit in the trunk, Mylar blankets and chemical heat packs and emergency rations, but accessing it would mean opening the door and exposing myself to wind chill that could cause frostbite in under 10 minutes. And I was trying to calculate whether I should stay in the car and wait for hypothermia or risk the trunk retrieval. When I saw the lights approaching through the blizzard, they resolved into headlights as they got closer, a vehicle moving slowly and carefully down the parkway from the direction I'd been heading, and I experienced a flood of relief so intense it was almost painful, salvation appearing exactly when I needed it. Except something about the approaching vehicle's movement pattern was off, its progress too steady given the road conditions, too confident for someone navigating a blizzard on a mountain highway covered in black ice. The vehicle pulled up beside my car and stopped, and through the snow I could make out the shape of an old pickup truck, maybe from the 70s or 80s, its paint that particular shade of faded blue that comes from decades of sun exposure. And a figure climbed out of the driver's side and tapped on my window, a man in his 60s wearing a wool coat and work gloves. His face weathered and kind and entirely unconcerned by the storm that was trying to kill everything caught in its path. "Rough night to be stuck," he said when I cracked my window, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I've got a cabin about 3 miles up the road, just off the parkway, wood stove and supplies. You're welcome to wait out the storm there until the plows come through." I should have questioned how he'd been driving in conditions that had defeated my much newer vehicle. Should have wondered about a cabin 3 miles from where I'd crashed, when I'd studied the map that morning and seen nothing but uninhabited wilderness in this section of the parkway. But I was cold and scared, and human psychology is designed to embrace salvation when it's offered, even if the circumstances of that salvation don't quite add up. I grabbed my bag and followed him to his truck, my boots immediately sinking into snow that came up past my knees. And I noticed as I climbed into the passenger seat that the truck's interior was warm. Actually warm, despite him having just been driving through sub-zero temperatures with what appeared to be no heater running. The cabin appeared exactly where he said it would be. Just visible through the trees in a small clearing, a structure of dark logs with smoke rising from a stone chimney. And I felt another wave of relief as we approached. Gratitude toward this stranger who'd appeared at exactly the right moment to prevent my death from exposure. He didn't talk much as he led me inside, just pointed out where I could hang my wet coat, where the bathroom was located, where I should sit by the wood stove to warm up. I was halfway through thanking him profusely when I noticed the photographs. On the mantel, dozens of framed images showing different people, different eras, judging by the clothing and photo quality, all of them standing in front of this same cabin, all of them smiling in that stiff, uncertain way people smile when they're not sure why they're being photographed. "Those are all folks I've helped over the years," he said, noticing my attention. "The parkway's dangerous in winter, always has been, and I like to keep a record of the people who've accepted my hospitality. Reminds me why I maintain this place, even though it's a lot of work for an old man living alone." Something about his phrasing bothered me. The way he said accepted my hospitality as if there were people who'd refused, as if he'd offered help to others who'd somehow declined and chosen different fates. And I turned to ask him about it and saw that he'd moved without making sound, was now standing between me and the door, his kind expression unchanged but his posture somehow predatory, suggesting readiness and patience and the absolute certainty of someone who knows the only exit is through them. "Here's how this works," he said, and his voice had changed subtly, had acquired layers of sound that suggested multiple speakers talking in unison. "The storm is real. Your car is really stuck. You really would have died out there if I hadn't. Come along, but nothing comes without cost in these mountains, and the price of salvation is always the same. You just have to decide if you're willing to pay it or if you'd rather go back out into the blizzard and take your chances with the cold." He gestured at the photographs on the mantel, and I noticed now what I'd missed before, that many of them showed the subjects with altered expressions, their smiles stretched too wide, their eyes reflecting light in ways that suggested something other than normal photographic flash, and several of the more recent images included the old man himself, standing beside his guests with his arm around their shoulders in poses that looked friendly until you noticed that his hand in each photo had too many fingers, or his smile showed too many teeth, or his shadow fell in directions that didn't match the light source. "You can stay here until the storm passes," he continued, "safe and warm and fed. And in exchange you'll let me take your photograph from my collection. And you'll forget the exact location of this cabin when you leave, and you'll never speak about what happens here to anyone who hasn't been here themselves. and most importantly, you'll come back. Every year on the anniversary of the night I saved you, and you'll spend one evening keeping me company, just conversation and a meal. Nothing harmful, nothing that will damage your life on the outside, just a small payment for the gift of continued existence. The alternative he didn't need to state. I could see it in the window behind him. The storm intensifying, snow falling so thick it looked like static, winds strong enough to make the cabin walls creak. Temperatures that would stop my heart in under an hour if I went back out there. I agreed. Of course, I agreed. I wanted to live more than I wanted to understand the implications of the agreement. And he smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth and took my photograph with an ancient Polaroid camera. The flash leaving purple after dancing across my vision, and he added the picture to his mantle collection while I watched the image develop, watched my own face materialize on the film, looking relieved and grateful and completely unaware that I'd just traded one type of death for something slower, something that would take years to fully manifest. He fed me stew from a pot that had been simmering on the wood stove, gave me blankets and a cot by the fire, and I slept deeply and dreamlessly while the storm raged outside. And when I woke the next morning, the sky was clear and blue and the parkway had been plowed and my car started on the first try, its engine running smoothly as if it had never failed. I found my way back to the main road without difficulty, drove the remaining distance to my sister's house, stayed for the weekend, and helped her pack boxers and offered support through her crying jags. And I didn't mention the cabin or the old man or the agreement I'd made, partly because he'd asked me not to, but mostly because I couldn't quite remember how to get back to that clearing even though I'd just left it hours before. The route through the trees already fading from my memory like a dream dissolving in daylight. A year later, on February 14th, I felt a pull I couldn't explain, an urgency that overrode my plans and my obligations, and I found myself driving the Blue Ridge Parkway in clear weather. Found myself turning onto a road I didn't remember being there. Found myself parking in front of a cabin that simultaneously felt completely familiar and entirely foreign, like visiting a place you've only seen in photographs. The old man was waiting on the porch, looking exactly as he had a year before, no older. Another soul who learned too late that death by exposure might have been kinder than survival with conditions attached. My GPS told me to take the exit for Highway 23 north toward Pound Gap, and I'd been following its directions without question for 6 hours. Too tired from the conference in Knoxville to second guess the route it had calculated, too focused on getting back to my hotel in Lexington to notice that the highway designations had stopped matching the signs about 40 miles back. That the landscape had shifted from the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky into terrain that looked older somehow, more primordial. Mountains that rose at angles that seemed geometrically impossible, and valleys that disappeared into darkness even though it was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I realized something was wrong when I passed the same abandoned gas station 3 times in the span of an hour. Its rusted pumps and shattered windows identical each time. The graffiti on its walls reading the same message in that strange backward script that looked almost like English but wasn't quite. Words that suggested meaning without conveying it. Like a language designed to be almost but not entirely comprehensible. I pulled over to check my physical map, the paper backup I always carried for situations like this, but when I spread it across the steering wheel, I found that Highway 23 on the map didn't match the road I was currently driving. The printed version showing a gentle curve through standard Appalachian geography while my actual route twisted through valleys and over ridges that appeared on no chart, passing through towns with names like Stillwell, Crossing, and Departure, and the place where she waits that definitely weren't. Official municipalities recognized by any state government. My phone showed full signal strength, but no actual connection. The bars displaying, but no data flowing. Like I was connected to a network that existed only to maintain the illusion of connectivity. And when I tried to make a call, I got the same recorded message every time. A woman's voice saying the number you have reached is not currently in service. Please check the number and try your call again, except the message played backward. The words inverted somehow so they sounded normal, but felt wrong. Like audio reflected through a mirror. The sun set without transitioning through dusk, just dropped behind the mountains and left me in immediate darkness that my headlights barely penetrated. And I noticed that the road had changed texture, was no longer asphalt but packed earth, then gravel, then something that might have been cobblestones, or might have been something organic, hard and slightly yielding under my tires, like driving over thick cartilage. The towns I passed through were populated but wrong. Their main streets lined with businesses that were operating normally except all the signs were in. That backward script and all the people I glimpsed through windows moved in synchronized patterns, turning their heads in unison when my car passed, standing from their chairs simultaneously like a congregation responding to some unheard cue. Their faces uniformly expressionless in my rearview mirror. I should have stopped for directions. Should have pulled into one of those well-lit diners or gas stations. But every time I slowed down, something primal in my brain screamed at me to keep driving. Warned me that stopping meant becoming part of whatever synchronized existence these towns represented. Meant losing the protection of forward momentum and accepting citizenship in a place where the rules of normal reality had been suspended in favor of something older and stranger. So I drove 4 hours for what felt like days. My fuel gauge stuck at 3/4, despite the distance I'd covered. My odometer advancing in patterns that didn't correspond to the miles I was traveling. Sometimes adding 50 miles in what my watch swore was 10 minutes. Sometimes adding nothing at all during stretches of road that seemed to extend forever. I saw the hitchhiker standing by the roadside around what my car clock insisted was 3 a.m. A woman in a white dress that looked formal, almost wedding-like. Her thumb extended in the universal gesture of someone seeking a ride, and I knew with absolute certainty that stopping for her would be the end of me. That whatever she was wearing, that human shape, wanted something that had nothing to do with transportation and everything to do with company, with claiming someone to exist alongside in this space between proper roads. But my car slowed anyway. My foot applying the brake without consulting my brain, my hand reaching for the passenger door lock to release it. And I only managed to regain control by biting my tongue hard enough to draw blood, the pain shocking me back into agency. My foot slamming the accelerator and sending my car lurching forward while the woman in white stood motionless in my mirrors. Not receding with distance, but simply becoming smaller, maintaining her position in my rear view even as the road curved and twisted. Her expression never changing from that patient, knowing smile that suggested she'd see me again, that there would be other nights and other opportunities, that I was now something she recognized and would continue recognizing whenever. I found myself on roads that didn't quite match their maps. The highway designation changed back to normal around dawn. The backward signs replaced by standard green. Markers for Interstate 23. The landscape shifting from impossible geometry to standard Appalachian terrain. And I pulled into the first familiar gas station I found, my hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the pump. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showing someone who'd aged years in a single night, gray streaks in my hair that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, lines around my eyes that suggested decades of stress compressed into hours of driving, through spaces that existed only tangentially to normal geography. The attendant looked at me with something between pity and recognition when I paid for my gas. and he told me in a voice that suggested he'd said this before to other travelers who'd emerged from the wrong roads. "You made it back? That's what matters, but you'll find the route again eventually. They always do. The wrong roads have a way of appearing in your GPS when you're tired or distracted. When you're not paying close enough attention to which exit you take, and each time you find them, they'll keep you a little longer, show you a little more, until eventually you'll realize you've been driving them more often than the normal roads, spending more time in the places that almost exist than in the places that definitely do. I've tried deleting the route from my GPS history, tried factory resetting my navigation system, tried using different devices and different mapping applications, but every few months I'll be driving somewhere unfamiliar and I'll notice, too late, that I've taken an exit that wasn't on my planned route, that the highway designation doesn't quite match what I remember, that the towns I'm passing through have names like Stillwell Crossing and Departure and the place where she waits, and I know I'm back on the wrong roads, the ones that appear in the spaces between official maps, the ones that are always looking for drivers who are willing to keep moving forward into territories where forward and backward become increasingly difficult to distinguish, where every mile traveled might be taking you closer to your destination or might be moving you laterally into a version of the world that diverged from consensus realities so long ago that the rules governing normal existence no longer fully apply. Last week I passed the woman in white again, and this time I stopped, and she climbed into my passenger seat with a smile that suggested we were old friends reuniting after a long separation. And she didn't speak, but she didn't need to. I could see in her eyes that she'd been waiting for me specifically, that our first encounter had been an interview rather than a chance meeting, and she's been riding with me ever since, directing me down routes that appear on no map, through towns that exist only during certain hours, past landmarks that shift and change depending on the angle of approach, and I've stopped fighting it, stopped trying to find my way back to the normal roads, because I understand now that there is no back, only forward into increasingly strange territory. And the woman in white sometimes reaches over and adjusts my radio. 2 stations that play music from decades that haven't occurred yet, songs about losses I haven't experienced and victories I'll never achieve, and I know that one day soon I'll arrive at a town that feels like destination rather than waypoint. A place where I'll finally understand what she's been guiding me toward, what purpose these wrong roads serve, what waits at the end of routes that exist only in the gaps between intention and arrival. And I suspect when I reach that final stop, I'll find all the other drivers who took the wrong exits and couldn't find their way back. All of us parked in a lot that extends forever in all directions. All of us sitting in our cars with the engines running and the radios playing songs from impossible futures. All of us waiting for whatever comes next to arrive and explain why we were chosen, why we were called, why the roads found us when we weren't paying close enough attention and marked us as belonging to the spaces between maps rather than the places maps were designed to chart. The lease on the hunting cabin had been in my family for 3 generations, a weathered structure deep in the Monongahela National Forest that my grandfather had built in 1963, where my father had taught me to track deer and field dress game, and read the forest for signs of animal movement. And when the lawyer called to tell me I'd inherited the property after Dad's stroke, I felt obligation mixed with dread, because I hadn't been back to that cabin in 15 years, not since the last hunting trip when we'd both seen something in the woods that we never discussed afterward. Something that had made my father sell all his rifles and refuse to return. Even when I'd offered to go with him, even when I'd suggested that maybe what we'd seen had been a bear or a trick of the light or some rational explanation we could discover if we just went back and confronted it. Now he was dead and the cabin was mine, and I owed it to his memory to at least go up there one more time. To close up the property properly, or decide whether to keep paying the lease or let it revert to the Forest Service, even though every instinct I possessed was telling me to just walk away, to sell the hunting gear without ever using it again, to let whatever claimed that section of woods maintain its territory without human interference. I made the drive in late January, timing it for the coldest part of winter, when most wildlife would be dormant and the forest would be as close to safe as it ever got. And the journey from the paved road to the cabin took 3 hours on increasingly deteriorating trails, my truck grinding through snow deep enough to scrape the undercarriage, past markers that I remembered from childhood, but that seemed somehow wrong now, positioned at slightly different angles or carved with notches that definitely hadn't been there 15 years ago. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, more ramshackle, its roof sagging in the middle and its windows dark with something thicker than normal dirt. And when I forced open the door, I found the interior exactly as we'd left it, our coffee cups still sitting on the table, our sleeping bags still laid out on the bunks, a deck of cards mid-game, as if we'd been planning to return after just a brief absence rather than abandoning the place permanently. The wrongness hit me before I'd even unpacked the truck, a quality of attention in the surrounding forest that suggested observation by multiple eyes from multiple angles, a sense of being evaluated by intelligence that predated human categories of thought. And I noticed that the trees surrounding the cabin clearing had changed, their bark showing patterns that looked almost like faces if you let your eyes unfocus, their branches extending in ways that seemed to reach toward the structure with something between curiosity and hunger. I'd brought supplies for 3 days, planning to inventory Dad's equipment and make decisions about what to keep. But standing in that cabin with the forest pressing in from all sides, I knew I'd be lucky to last 3 hours. Knew that whatever had driven us away 15 years ago was still here, still watching, still waiting for someone to return and complete whatever transaction we'd started and failed to finish during that last hunting trip. The deer appeared in the clearing around dusk, a massive buck with antlers that branched in geometrically impossible patterns, fractaling into increasingly small iterations of themselves like mathematical equations made from bone. And it stood at the edge of the tree line, staring directly at the cabin with eyes that reflected light in colors that deer eyes shouldn't produce. Violet and green and something that might have been ultraviolet if humans could perceive that spectrum without instruments. I watched it from the window for 20 minutes, my breath fogging the glass, and it never moved, never blinked, just maintained its vigil with the patience of something that operates on geological timescales rather than biological ones. And I remembered with sudden clarity what my father and I had seen 15 years ago. Remembered the way that buck, or one exactly like it, had walked into our camp and stood over our dying fire. Remembered how all the sounds of the forest had stopped simultaneously when it appeared. Remembered the way it had opened its mouth and spoken in my grandfather's voice, asking us, "Are you ready to understand what he paid for this place? What he promised in exchange for 3 generations of safe hunting? What debt comes due when the original agreement expires?" We'd run then, my father and I, loaded our gear in panicked haste, and driven back to civilization without speaking, without processing, without confronting what we'd both heard and seen. And I understood now with horrible certainty that running had been the wrong choice, that there had been a conversation we were supposed to have, an inheritance we were supposed to claim that had nothing to do with property rights and everything to do with whatever compact my grandfather had made with the things that inhabited these woods. Whatever price he'd agreed to pay in exchange for safe passage and successful hunts and 3 generations of family tradition that we'd terminated, prematurely by fleeing instead of listening. The buck was still there at full dark, still watching, and I could see now that it wasn't alone, that the forest behind it was full of shapes that might have been deer, or might have been people, or might have been something that could wear either form, depending on what the situation required, and they were all oriented toward the cabin, all waiting for me to make a decision about whether I would honor my grandfather's agreement or break it. Permantly. I found his journal in the cabinet, under the sink, hidden behind old cleaning supplies that had fossilized with age. A leather-bound book filled with his precise handwriting, dated entries spanning 40 years, and the final entry was dated the week before he died. His hand shakier than in earlier pages, but his message clear. The agreement was that each generation would provide one hunter to maintain the balance, to keep the sacred places marked and the boundaries respected, to serve as liaison between the human world and the older world that still claims these mountains as its domain. And I failed by not telling your father what this responsibility entailed. Failed by letting him run when the changing of the guard was proposed. And now the debt has compounded with interest. And they're patient, but not infinitely so. And whoever inherits this cabin will need to make the choice I should have forced on him, to either accept the role or renounce the lease and everything that comes with it, including the protection it's afforded our family for 3 generations. The luck and success and absence of tragedy that wasn't coincidence but payment for services rendered. The buck tapped its antlers against the cabin wall, a rhythmic pattern that might have been Morse code or might have been something older. And I understood that I was being asked a question, being offered a choice between walking away and losing whatever invisible protection had kept my family safe for decades, or stepping outside and accepting a responsibility I didn't fully understand, becoming something between a park ranger and a priest for territories that existed in the margins, between official wilderness and whatever wildness predated human classification systems. I thought about my father's sudden stroke at 62, about my uncle's car accident 3 years after we'd abandoned the cabin, about the series of small catastrophes that had plagued our family since we'd broken the agreement, and I realized that refusing wasn't really an option, that the protection worked both ways, and its absence had consequences that accumulated gradually until they became catastrophic. And the only question was whether I had the courage to open that door and step into a role I'd spent 15 years avoiding. I don't remember making the conscious decision to go outside, but I found myself standing in the clearing with the snow falling gently around me and the buck approaching with its impossible antlers. And it spoke again in my grandfather's voice, explaining the terms of the agreement, the responsibilities, I would assume, the changes I would undergo as I learned to navigate between the human world and the world it represented. And I listened until dawn while the forest full of watchers slowly dispersed, satisfied that the line would continue, that another generation had accepted the burden, and when I finally returned to the cabin, my reflection in the window showed subtle alterations, my eyes catching light at different angles, my posture adjusted to something more comfortable in wilderness than civilization. And I knew that I would keep the lease and return to the cabin regularly, that I would learn to perform the duties my grandfather had performed. Marking sacred boundaries and maintaining balances I was only beginning to understand, and failure is possible, but comes with consequences that extend far beyond your individual life, touching everyone you've ever loved or will love. Because protection withdrawn leaves vacuums that darker things rush to fill, and these mountains have always had both protectors and predators, and you've just been asked to choose which you'll become, and you've made your choice. And now you'll live with it for however many years remain before you need to pass the burden forward. hoping whoever inherits understands that some legacies are heavier than property. Some inheritances more complex than simple ownership, and, some cabins and some forests come with covenants written in arrangements older than deeds, binding in ways that survive death and distance and every attempt to escape through forgetting.